The airplane nobody wanted just shot down 2 MiGs. That's how a Navy pilot from VFA-81 summarized January 17, 1991, according to accounts published after the war. The mission report from that morning reads like a clerical error. 2 F/A-18C Hornets from the Sunliners, call signs working a strike package against H-3 airfield in western Iraq, engaged and destroyed 2 Iraqi MiG-21s with AIM-9M Sidewinder missiles. Lieutenant Commander Mark Fox and Lieutenant Nick Mongillo each got one. The kills happened at approximately 0640 hours, barely 90 minutes, into Desert Storm. Both pilots were carrying 4 Mark 83 1,000-pound bombs apiece when they made the intercepts. After downing the MiGs, Fox and Mongillo continued to the target and dropped their ordnance on the airfield. They flew home, trapped aboard USS Saratoga, and filed their paperwork. The after-action report noted the ordnance expenditure, 2 Sidewinders, 8 bombs, with the bureaucratic indifference of a grocery receipt. Nobody in the intelligence shop had expected the Hornet to produce the first Navy air-to-air kills of the war. The F-14 Tomcat was supposed to own that mission. Grumman's twin-engine interceptor carried the AWG-9 radar and the AIM-54 Phoenix, a combination designed to engage 6 targets simultaneously at ranges beyond 100 nautical miles. The entire carrier air-wing fighter doctrine revolved around the Tomcat, establishing air superiority, while the attack aircraft, a 6 Intruders, a 7 Corsair IIs, and those compromised Hornets, went in behind the screen to hit ground targets. The Tomcat would end the entire Gulf War with a single air-to-air kill. 1. An F-14B from VF-32 downed an Mi-8 helicopter on February 6, 1991, using an AIM-9. The Hornet, the airplane Congress had forced on the Navy, the jet that the Fighter Mafia despised as too slow, too short-legged, too compromised by its dual-role mandate, that airplane scored 2 kills on opening night while hauling enough iron bombs to flatten a city block. Fox's engagement lasted roughly 40 seconds from radar contact to missile impact. He picked up the MiG-21 on his APG-65 radar at about 10 miles, identified it as hostile, selected Sidewinder, and fired. Mongillo's kill followed a similar profile moments later. Neither pilot jettisoned their bombs before engaging. 4,000 pounds of drag and inertia hanging under each wing, and the Hornet still maneuvered well enough to prosecute a beyond visual range intercept, transitioning to a short-range heat-seeker shot. The jet did what McDonnell Douglas had always said it would do. A generation of Navy brass had insisted otherwise. Rewind 10 years from that morning over Iraq, and the F/A-18 was the most politically toxic aircraft in the Department of Defense inventory. The program had been born from the wreckage of a canceled lightweight fighter competition, stitched together from congressional mandates, inter-service budget warfare, a fundamental disagreement about what a carrier-based fighter should be, and the raw political gravity of district-level jobs programs. Admirals who had flown Phantoms in Vietnam wanted a pure air superiority machine to eventually replace the F-14. The Pentagon wanted cost savings. What Congress wanted was jobs in specific districts, and it had the appropriations leverage to get them. The compromise that emerged satisfied nobody completely. Vice Admiral Kent Lee, who ran Naval Air Systems Command during the Hornet's development, later acknowledged the enormous institutional resistance the program faced from within the Navy's own fighter community. The Tomcat crews looked at the Hornet's combat radius of roughly 340 nautical miles on a strike mission, compared to the F-14's 500+, and dismissed it as a short-range toy. The designation itself was an act of bureaucratic optimism. F/A-18. Fighter/attack. 2 missions crammed into one airframe because the budget couldn't support 2 separate aircraft. Every engineering trade-off that designation implied became ammunition for the Hornet's critics. They spent a decade sharpening those arguments, and the Hornet had no combat record to push back with, not until Iraq. The YF-17 prototype first flew on June 9, 1974, out of Edwards Air Force Base, a dry, windless morning where the Mojave heat was already warping the taxiway by 0800 hours. The aircraft that would eventually become the F/A-18 Hornet didn't belong to the Navy. It belonged to Northrop, built for an Air Force competition the Air Force had never really wanted to run. The lightweight fighter program was the brainchild of a small, stubborn group of Pentagon analysts and military officers who called themselves the Fighter Mafia. Colonel John Boyd, the most intellectually aggressive officer in the Air Force, had spent years arguing that the service was buying the wrong airplanes. The F-15 Eagle, just entering production in the early 1970s, was too heavy, too expensive, and far too dependent on radar and missiles that didn't work half the time over Vietnam. Boyd and his allies, including Pentagon systems analyst Pierre Sprey and test pilot Colonel Everest Riccioni, wanted a small, cheap, agile dogfighter built around energy maneuverability theory. Boyd's theory, reduced to its essentials, held that the fighter with superior specific excess power at any given speed and altitude would control the engagement. You didn't need the biggest radar. You needed the fastest transient performance, the ability to shift from one energy state to another before your opponent could react. The Air Force brass loathed the idea. They had just committed billions to the F-15 and viewed the lightweight fighter as a political threat to that program. But Boyd had cultivated allies in Congress, particularly in the office of Senator Barry Goldwater, and the Defense Department's Director of Defense Research and Engineering, John Foster, authorized funding for two competing prototypes. General Dynamics built the YF-16. Northrop built the YF-17 Cobra. Both flew in 1974. The YF-16 won. It was lighter, cheaper, pulled more sustained Gs, and had a single engine, which the Air Force preferred for cost and logistics reasons. The YF-17 was a twin-engine design powered by two General Electric YJ-101 turbojets, producing about 15,000 pounds of thrust each in afterburner. Northrop's airplane had better high angle of attack behavior and arguably superior handling qualities at slow speeds, but the competition wasn't close on cost. The Air Force selected the YF-16 in January 1975. The YF-17 was dead. Except Congress had other plans. The Navy was watching the lightweight fighter competition with institutional horror. The service had zero interest in a small, cheap fighter. Naval aviation's identity in the mid-1970s was built around the F-14 Tomcat, Grumman's magnificent, expensive, maintenance-intensive fleet defender. Each Tomcat cost roughly $38 million by the time the program stabilized, and the Navy wanted more of them. Congressional appropriators saw those unit costs climbing and started asking uncomfortable questions. Deputy Secretary of Defense William Clements directed the Navy to evaluate derivatives of both lightweight fighter finalists for a new low-cost complement to the Tomcat. The Navy's response was approximately the bureaucratic equivalent of a slammed door. Service leadership made clear, through every available channel, that they did not want a lightweight fighter adapted for carrier operations. They wanted more Tomcats, and beyond that, they wanted the A-18, a dedicated attack replacement for the aging A-7 Corsair II, built to Navy specifications from scratch. Congress didn't care what the Navy wanted. The fiscal reality of the late 1970s made a pure F-14 fleet unaffordable, and the political reality was that legislators in districts with Northrop and McDonnell Douglas facilities had votes to protect. The Navy was ordered, the word ordered is not an exaggeration, to select one of the two lightweight fighter derivatives for carrier use. McDonnell Douglas partnered with Northrop to develop the YF-17 into a carrier-capable aircraft, and in May 1975, the Navy reluctantly chose the resulting proposal over a General Dynamics F-16 variant. The rationale was straightforward: twin engines over water. A single-engine fighter operating hundreds of miles from the nearest divert field made naval aviators nervous in a way no performance chart could offset. So, the Navy got an airplane derived from a competition it hadn't asked for, designed around a philosophy it didn't share. The contractor partnership behind it, McDonnell Douglas and Northrop, would spend the next decade in litigation over work share and intellectual property. McDonnell Douglas, as prime contractor, would redesign roughly 90% of the airframe to meet carrier structural requirements: folding wings, and the weight penalties of a beefed-up landing gear designed to survive repeated arrested landings at sink rates that would collapse the YF-17 structure. "We're going to build the world's first true multirole fighter," McDonnell Douglas program manager John Capilupo told his engineering team in St. Louis, according to company histories published after the program matured. The statement was either visionary or delusional, depending on which side of the Potomac you sat on. Every previous attempt to merge the fighter and attack missions into a single airframe had produced an aircraft that did both jobs poorly. The F-111 was supposed to be the universal fighter bomber for both services. It ended up as a medium bomber that couldn't dogfight and a Navy variant, the F-111B, so heavy it could barely get off the carrier deck. That program's wreckage was still politically radioactive when McDonnell Douglas started bending metal on the F/A-18. The engineering challenge was real, and it went well beyond bureaucratic theater. A fighter needs to be light, with high thrust-to-weight ratio, optimized for air-to-air maneuvering at medium altitudes. An attack aircraft needs range, payload capacity, low-altitude ride quality, and sensors tuned for finding targets on the ground. More fuel means more weight means less maneuverability. A wing optimized for high G, turning at 25,000 feet, performs differently when you're hauling 10,000 pounds of ordnance at 200 feet through turbulence. McDonnell Douglas gambled, repeatedly and deliberately. The wing ended up as a moderately swept mid-mount design with a relatively low wing loading of about 94 pounds per square foot at combat weight. Good for maneuvering, acceptable for low-altitude ride, ideal for carrier approach speeds. Leading-edge extensions running forward from the wing roots to the cockpit generated powerful vortices at high angles of attack, giving the Hornet controllability in regimes where the F-14 would depart into a spin. But the decision that actually mattered came next. McDonnell Douglas committed to a fully digital fly-by-wire flight control system with no mechanical backup. The F-16 had pioneered this approach, but the Hornets system went further. It was quadruple redundant, meaning 4 independent computers voted on every control input, and the aircraft could sustain 2 failures and keep flying. The pilot's stick inputs went through software that could be reprogrammed for different mission profiles. Pull the trigger in air-to-air mode, and the flight control laws optimized for gun tracking. Switch to air-to-ground, and the system smoothed out the ride for weapons delivery. Same airplane, different flying characteristics, selectable by the pilot. The APG-65 radar made the rest of it work. Hughes Aircraft built a multi-mode pulse Doppler set that could track while scanning in air-to-air mode, then switched to synthetic aperture ground mapping for precision strike. Previous fighters carried radars that did one thing well. The APG-65 did several things adequately, which was exactly the point. The system weighed roughly 220 pounds less than the F-14's AWG-9, sacrificing raw detection range for versatility and reliability. Where the AWG-9 could track targets at 120-plus nautical miles, the APG-65 was effective at roughly 40 to 50 in a typical combat environment. The Tomcat community pointed at that gap like prosecutors presenting evidence. What the Tomcat community didn't mention was that the APG-65 achieved a mean time between failures of over 100 hours in fleet service, at a time when the AWG-9 averaged closer to 15. August 7, 1990, 72 hours after Iraqi tanks rolled into Kuwait City, USS Saratoga received orders to deploy to the Red Sea. The carrier had just come out of a yard period and wasn't scheduled for deployment until October. The Air Wing embarked in a compressed timeline that left maintenance crews working 20-hour shifts to get aircraft carrier qualified. VFA-81, the Sunliners, brought 12 F/A-18C Hornets aboard, the newest block of the aircraft, equipped with the upgraded APG-65 radar and full compatibility with the AIM-7M Sparrow, the AIM-9M Sidewinder, and the full range of Navy air-to-ground ordnance. For the next 5 months, those jets would fly training sorties over the Red Sea while the intelligence staff built target folders for a war that everyone aboard knew was coming. The strike planning for what became the opening night of Desert Storm went through dozens of revisions between October 1990 and January 1991. Saratoga's Air Wing, CVW-17, was assigned targets in western Iraq, far from the main concentration of Iraqi forces in Kuwait. The H-3 complex, a sprawling Iraqi airbase near the Jordanian border, sat roughly 550 nautical miles from Saratoga's operating area in the Red Sea. The distance created problems immediately. The Hornets' combat radius on a strike profile with 4 Mark 83 bombs, 2 Sidewinders, 2 Sparrows, and a centerline fuel tank came to approximately 340 nautical miles. The math didn't work without tanking, multiple tanking in fact. The strike package would need to hit KC-135 tankers on the way in and again on the way out. Mission planners built fuel ladders with almost no margin. A missed tanker rendezvous meant a jet turning back or, worse, flaming out over hostile territory. The Tomcat's range advantage, the one the F-14 community had spent a decade highlighting, was a legitimate operational concern on this specific mission profile. VFA-81's pilots planned for a pure air-to-ground mission. The Hornets were loaded for strike, configured to deliver bombs on H-3's runways, taxiways, and hardened aircraft shelters. Air-to-air was the F-14's job. Saratoga's 2 Tomcat squadrons, VF-74 and VF-103, were supposed to sweep ahead of the strike package and sanitize the airspace. The Hornet crews carried Sidewinders and Sparrows as self-defense weapons, doctrinal insurance, not primary armament. Nobody briefed the Sunliners to go looking for MiGs. Commander Dennis Mongillo, the squadron's operations officer, later described the pre-mission brief as focused almost entirely on the strike timeline, tanker coordination, and egress routing. The air-to-air contingency occupied maybe 5 minutes of a 2-hour brief. What the intelligence section did emphasize was the Iraqi integrated air defense system. H-3 sat inside a dense SAM belt, SA-2 guidelines, SA-3 GOAs, SA-6 gainfuls, overlapping at multiple altitudes. Roland short-range systems ringed the airfield itself. The ingress plan called for the strike package to fly at medium altitude, above the AAA and short-range IR threats, below the effective ceiling of the long-range SAMs, threading a narrow band between roughly 15,000 and 20,000 feet. Electronic warfare support from EA-6B prowlers would suppress the acquisition radars. Harm-shooting F/A-18S from another squadron would kill any emitter that came up. The Sunliners would ride in behind that suppression wave, deliver ordnance, and get out. Clean, sequential, rehearsed dozens of times. The possibility that Iraqi fighters might penetrate the Tomcat screen and reach the strike package was assessed as low probability. The mission planning cell gave it perhaps a 10% chance. Somewhere over the Saudi-Iraqi border, at approximately 0340 hours local time on January 17, 1991, Lieutenant Commander Mark M.R.T. Fox checked his fuel state and found it adequate. The tanker rendezvous had gone smoothly. His F/A-18C carried 4 Mark 83,000-pound bombs, 2 AIM-9M Sidewinders, 2 AIM-7M Sparrows, and a centerline drop tank that was already feeding the twin F-404 engines at a rate that made the fuel ladder feel more like a fuel tightrope. Commander Mongillo was on his wing. Both jets were heavy, configured for the strike mission they'd briefed for months. The APG-65 radars were in air-to-ground mode. 40 miles south of H-3, Mongillo's radar warning receiver lit up. Then Fox's. Iraqi early warning radars were painting the strike package, which was expected. What was not expected was the call from an E-2C Hawkeye, the airborne early warning aircraft coordinating the strike, reporting 2 fast-moving contacts heading south toward the Hornet formation. Iraqi fighters, likely MiG-21s, had launched from an airfield the Tomcat sweep had not yet sanitized. The 10% contingency was now the situation. Fox and Mongillo did something that no fighter pilot in history had been asked to do quite this way. They switched their radars from air-to-ground to air-to-air mode while still carrying full bomb loads. The APG-65 transitioned in seconds, the same radar, the same box of electronics, now scanning for airborne targets instead of mapping terrain. The fly-by-wire system didn't care that each jet weighed close to 48,000 pounds. The flight control computers adjusted for the asymmetric loadout and the high gross weight and kept the aircraft flyable at combat maneuvering onset. Fox locked the lead MiG-21 at approximately 15 nautical miles. He fired a Sparrow. The missile guided and tracked. The contact disappeared from his scope. Elapsed time from radar lock to kill, roughly 10 seconds. Mongillo engaged the second MiG-21, also with a Sparrow. His missile also guided. The second MiG came apart in the dark sky over western Iraq. Both Iraqi pilots ejected, according to post-war intelligence assessments, though confirmation of their survival remains incomplete. 40 seconds, maybe less. 2 MiG-21s detected, engaged, destroyed by strike fighters carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs apiece. Fox and Mongillo didn't jettison their ordnance or call for Tomcat support. They stayed on mission. They killed the MiGs, switched their radars back to air-to-ground mode, and continued north toward H3. The strike itself was almost anticlimactic by comparison. The prowlers had done their work. The SAM radars were suppressed or destroyed. VF-A-81's Hornets rolled in on H3's infrastructure and delivered their Mark 83s on target, on time, within the planned window. Fox and Mongillo each put bombs on their assigned aim points. The squadron egressed south, hit the post-strike tanker, and recovered aboard Saratoga before dawn. Every jet came back. Meanwhile, the F-14 Tomcat, the Navy's dedicated air superiority fighter, built and procured for the sole purpose of shooting down enemy aircraft, an entire institutional identity wrapped around fleet air defense, would finish the entire Gulf War with a single air-to-air kill. 1. An Iraqi My-8 helicopter, shot down by an F-14A from VF-1 on the first day. The Tomcat's AIM-54 Phoenix missile, the $6 million long-range weapon that justified the AWG-9 radar and the two-man crew and the variable geometry wings, was fired exactly twice in combat during Desert Storm. Both shots missed. The weapon that was supposed to define naval air combat for a generation went 0 for 2 against Iraqi aircraft that, by most accounts, were not maneuvering aggressively. The Hornet squadrons, collectively, recorded the Navy's only fixed-wing air-to-air kills of the war. This was the airplane Congress forced on the Navy, the compromise platform the Tomcat community had spent a decade dismissing as inadequate for fleet defense. It did what the F-14 was built to do, and then went and bombed the target anyway. Captain Dale Snort Snodgrass flew the F-14 Tomcat better than almost anyone alive. He was the Navy's lead Tomcat demonstration pilot, the man who pulled the jet through routines at air shows that made the variable geometry wings look like they were breathing. He once said in a published interview that the Tomcat was the greatest air superiority fighter ever built. By January 1991, that claim rested entirely on reputation and exercises, on the promise of what the F-14 would do when the moment came. The moment came. What followed gutted the Tomcat's legacy. The numbers require no editorial. The F-14 community flew hundreds of combat sorties during Desert Storm. The combined Tomcat force across multiple carrier air wings generated thousands of flight hours in the Kuwait theater of operations. The jet's primary mission, fleet air defense, offensive counter-air, establishing and maintaining air superiority over the battle group, was the reason the aircraft existed. Grumman had built 712 of them. The Navy had invested billions in the airframe, the engines, the AWG-9 weapon system, the AIM-54 Phoenix missile that could theoretically engage 6 targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 100 nautical miles. The entire F-14 program was predicated on a single scenario: Soviet bombers and cruise missiles inbound toward the carrier battle group, and Tomcats racing out to kill them at maximum range before they could launch. Iraq wasn't the Soviet Union, but Iraqi pilots were flying Soviet-built aircraft using Soviet tactics. If the Tomcat couldn't prove itself here, where exactly was it going to? On January 17th, an F-14A from VF-1, the Wolfpack, embarked aboard USS Ranger, engaged and destroyed an Iraqi My-8 HIP helicopter with an AIM-9M Sidewinder, a helicopter. The Tomcat's sole air-to-air kill of the entire war was a rotary-wing aircraft flying at low altitude, at low speed, with no electronic countermeasures and no ability to maneuver against a supersonic interceptor. The two AIM-54 Phoenix shots fired during the conflict, weapons that cost approximately $477,000 apiece in 1991 dollars, both failed to connect. Post-war analysis suggested guidance issues, though the precise failure mode on each shot remains a matter of some debate in the technical literature. What isn't debated is the outcome, 0 for 2. The longest-range air-to-air missile in the Western inventory, the weapon that justified a 2-seat crew and a 62,000-pound airframe, couldn't hit Iraqi jets that coalition intelligence assessed as flying with limited situational awareness and degraded ground control intercept support. The Tomcat community had explanations. Rules of engagement required visual identification before firing at beyond visual range targets, which negated the Phoenix's standoff advantage. Iraqi fighters avoided engagement, running north whenever coalition radar coverage suggested they'd been detected. The F-14's tasking often placed it in barrier combat air patrol stations, where Iraqi aircraft simply didn't show up. All of these points have merit. None of them changed the scoreboard. And that scoreboard sat in the ready rooms of every Hornet squadron in the fleet like a loaded weapon. The F/A-18, shorter ranged, smaller radared, single seat, carrying bombs, had done the F-14's job on the F-14's war. Fox and Mongillo hadn't been looking for a fight. They'd found one, handled it in under a minute, and continued with their actual mission. The Tomcat couldn't make that claim. It had nothing. The jet that was supposed to own the sky over the Persian Gulf finished the war with a helicopter kill and 2 missed Phoenix shots. The Navy didn't hold a press conference about it. Nobody needed to. The maintenance logs told the story just as clearly. Tomcat squadrons were reporting mission-capable rates, hovering around 55%, while Hornet units consistently pushed above 90. One aircraft needed 25 maintenance man-hours per flight hour. The other needed roughly 15. The war didn't kill the F-14. It just made the pretending impossible. September 22nd, 2006, 15:32 hours local time. Lieutenant Commander Chris Elwood, Richard of VFA-211, the Fighting Checkmates, catapulted off USS Enterprise in an F/A-18F Super Hornet for a combat sortie over Afghanistan. The jet he flew shared a name with the aircraft Fox and Mongillo had taken to war 15 years earlier. Almost nothing else carried over. The Super Hornet was 25% larger, carried 33% more fuel internally, had a wider weapons envelope, and generated 35,000 pounds of thrust from 2 F414 engines that were themselves evolved from the F404 but produced nearly 40% more power. The airframe was so extensively redesigned that Boeing engineers privately acknowledged it was a new airplane wearing an old name, a political decision, not an engineering one, because a modification of an existing program was easier to push through Congress than a clean sheet procurement. That political maneuvering started in 1992, when the Gulf War's maintenance data hit the Pentagon's budget offices like a brick through a window. The F-14D, Grumman's final most capable Tomcat variant, fitted with APG-71 radar and new GE F1.10 engines that finally solved the TF3 compressor stall problem, had been in production for barely 2 years. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney killed the program. He capped F-14D production at 37 new-build aircraft and 18 rebuilds from older airframes. Grumman fought the decision. Congressional delegations from Long Island, where Grumman employed thousands, fought it harder and louder. Cheney's reasoning was blunt. The Hornet was cheaper to buy, fly, and maintain, and had just proven in combat that it could do the Tomcat's job while simultaneously doing its own. The F/A-18E/F development contract went to McDonnell Douglas in 1992 with a unit flyaway cost target of $57 million. roughly half what a new-build F-14D would have run. The Super Hornet first flew on November 29, 1995, out of Lambert Field in St. Louis. Test pilot Fred Czar Madenwald took it supersonic on the fourth flight. The jet entered fleet service with VFA 122 in 1999 and deployed operationally for the first time aboard USS Abraham Lincoln in 2002, flying combat missions over Iraq before the 2003 invasion even began. By then, the original Hornet had already been exported to Canada, Australia, Spain, Finland, Switzerland, Kuwait, and Malaysia. 8 nations that looked at the Gulf War results and reached the same conclusion the Pentagon's accountants had. Canada's CF-18S were dropping bombs over Kosovo in 1999. Australia's flew combat in Iraq in 2003. Finland bought 64 of them to replace MiG-21s along the Russian border, a detail worth pausing on, given what Fox did to a pair of MiG-21s over H3. The last operational F-14 Tomcat flight in U.S. Navy service occurred on October 4, 2006. VF-31, the Tomcatters, a squadron whose identity was literally built around the aircraft, flew the final sortie. The jet that was supposed to be the Navy's fighter for the 21st century didn't make it past the first decade. Its replacement on every carrier deck in the fleet was the Super Hornet. The Congressional Compromise, a forced marriage between a lightweight Air Force prototype and a Navy that didn't want it, now owned the flight deck entirely. Strike fighters filled the slots where dedicated interceptors once sat. The two-seat F/A-18F carried a weapons systems officer who could manage sensors, targeting pods, and data links in a way that made the old Tomcat RIO's scope look like a cathode ray television. Fox retired as a rear admiral. Mongillo made captain. The MiG kills remained the Navy's only Hornet air-to-air victories, but the point had been made on January 17, 1991. Nobody needed a repeat demonstration. The after-action report from VFA 81's January 17th strike on H3. Airfield crossed the desk of the carrier air wing commander aboard Saratoga before Fox and Mongillo had finished their debrief breakfast. It read like any other sortie summary. Call signs, weapons expended, battle damage assessment, fuel states at each waypoint. Buried in the middle, almost as an afterthought, 2 lines noted the engagement and destruction of 2 Iraqi MiG-21 aircraft during the ingress. The tone was clerical. What it documented was not. The report looked like every other piece of administrative paperwork aboard Saratoga, but it documented something the Navy had spent 15 years insisting was impossible. A strike fighter, laden with bombs, had seamlessly transitioned to air-to-air combat, killed 2 adversary aircraft, transitioned back, and completed the strike mission as briefed. The airplane nobody wanted had just proved every critic wrong. By 2024, the F/A-18 family had accumulated over 12 million flight hours across all variants and operators. More than 1,480 Hornets were built in St. Louis before the original production line closed in 2000. The Super Hornet line continued past 600 airframes. 9 nations fly or have flown the type operationally. The platform has dropped ordnance in Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. It has flown combat missions in every major American military operation since 1986, when Hornets from VFA 131 and VFA 132 struck Libyan air defenses during Operation Prairie Fire. The F-4 Phantom held the title of most widely operated American fighter of the Cold War era. The Hornet took that crown and kept it for the post-Cold War period with a production run, export record, operational tempo, and geographic reach that no contemporary Western fighter has matched. The Northrop engineers who designed the YF-17 Cobra in 1974 would not recognize the Block 3 Super Hornet rolling off Boeing's line today. Conformal fuel tanks, an infrared search and track sensor, the APG-79 AESA radar, advanced networking capabilities. The technology gap between the 2 aircraft spans half a century of avionics evolution. The DNA is still there, though, in the twin-engine layout and the leading-edge extensions, in the fundamental aerodynamic philosophy that Lee Begin and his team sketched on drafting tables in Hawthorne, California. The airplane nobody wanted just shot down 2 MiGs. That was how a VFA-81 pilot summarized it in 1991. Over 1,480 airframes, 9 countries, and 12 million flight hours later, the after-action report from H-3 sits in the Naval History and Heritage Command archives. It's 2 pages long,